morning, and thank you everyone for coming. Once again today, we have welcome back Pastor Adam Yu to preach to us. He's going to go through, his title is Trust Jesus in Our Storms, and the passage is in the book of Mark. So please turn with me to the book of Mark chapter 4. And Ryan, when you get there, I'd like you to read it for us. Let me know when you got to Mark chapter 4. Verse what? Verse 35 to verse 41.
That day, when we came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." They then were crowd behind, they took him along, just to see what is in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke up, said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and was on wind. He said to his disciples, "Why were you so afraid? Do you still have faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this speaking of wind and waves?"
Thank you, Ryan. And with that, we'll pass the time back to Pastor Yu.
All right, good morning, everyone. As Henry has said, I'm Pastor Ivan Yu. I'm currently a youth pastor at the Chinese Gospel Church of Massachusetts in Southborough. So it's great to have another opportunity this Sunday to be able to share from God's Word with everyone. Now, I know that it's good to be back in person, with everyone at church. So maybe next time I come, I can be able to actually visit you guys and preach to you face to face. So hopefully, Lord willing, I look forward to be able to meeting you guys in person. But as we just read in this passage today, we know that today we're going to be talking about certain elements of a storm. Now, I don't know if you all have any experience being in a storm before. It could be like a snowstorm, it could be a rainstorm, like a typhoon, whatever it may be. But I had a similar experience before. So back in 2018, I had attended a Christian leaders trip to the Grand Canyon with Canyon Ministries and with Answers in Genesis. So basically, in this trip, I spent a whole week down inside the Grand Canyon, did some camping there with some other leaders, and also rafted down the Colorado River. So this is my first time camping and being in the outdoors, and it was very beautiful. When was nighttime, I was sleeping on a cot. I didn't have a tent or anything. Looked up in the sky. There was a lot of beautiful stars. But then that first night, there was a storm that came. It was a rainstorm. All of a sudden, boom, in the middle of the night, big downpours of rain on top of me. And I was there. Again, I'm not in a tent. I'm out there just sleeping on a cot. And I'm just thinking, why am I even here? And apparently, there's supposed to be a tarp that they had given me that I can use to cover myself, wrap myself around like a burrito. But then, the tarp that I was given actually had holes in it. So it didn't really shield me from the rain. Some of the water seeped through the tarp, and I was still very wet and cold. And again, I'm thinking, why am I here? So I was literally in a fetal position, hugging myself, rocking myself back and forth. And I'm thinking, no, God, why am I here? Why do you have to let me suffer and be so cold and very wet in the middle of this a storm? It's my first time camping outdoors. I don't like this experience. Now, I think many of us, we may need to be reminded that we can trust in Jesus. So just like some of the physical storm that I just described here, I think many of us may go through what we call spiritual storms in our lives. So these storms are the trials and the sufferings that we go through. So for example, if you're a student, you may be very stressed with the work that you have to do, getting good grades, trying to please your parents, or maybe as an adult, you're so stressed about getting your bills paid. You're worried about your relationships with your family because there's some drama that's going on, and you just sometimes don't think that anyone can be able to understand what you are going through, and it can be very painful. So this is the description of a storm, a spiritual storm that we can go through because it affects our relationship with God. It feels like there is rain that is constantly pelting against you and the winds pushing you around. But even in the midst of these spiritual storms, we can trust Jesus during these storms of our lives. So how can we understand these storms. So I know that we already read our passage for today in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. But as we go through this passage, we're going to be answering one main question. So if you're someone who likes to take notes, I encourage you to write this question down. So the main question we're going to be answering today is, how can we trust Jesus during our storms? Okay, so how can we trust Jesus during our storms? And from this passage that we had just read, there's going to be three ways that we can be able to trust Jesus during our storms. So let's return back to our passage in Mark chapter 4, and let's read from verse 35 again. It says, "On that day, when evening had come, Jesus had said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.' And leaving the crowds, they took him in the boat just as he was, and the other boats were with him." So here we see Jesus had just spent a whole day teaching crowds of people who were following him in Capernaum. And at the end of the day, you can imagine how tired Jesus must have been. And he said, okay, he said to his disciples, let's go into a boat and go across the sea to the other side. And this is the east side of the Sea of Galilee, where there weren't as many people. But as Jesus was telling his disciples, okay, let's travel to the other side of the sea, Jesus knew that there was going to be a storm there. Jesus knew that he was leading them into this storm. So as we think about our storms, our trials and sufferings, and our spiritual storms that we may be experiencing right now, in Jesus' plan and his sovereignty, we have to recognize that Jesus is the one who actually leads us into these hard situations. He's the one who leads us into these storms. And he doesn't lead us into these storms necessarily because we have done anything wrong or we're being disciplined. So why? Why does Jesus lead us into our storms? What is the purpose? Think about this. Jesus leads us into our storms, and our storms leads us to Jesus. I'll say it again. Jesus leads us into our storms, but our storms leads us to Jesus. In our current trials, in our current sufferings and hardships, do they lead us back to Jesus? Do they lead us to know Jesus more and to grow closer to him? See, the purpose of this storm that Jesus brought his disciples through actually accomplished that purpose. Jump over with me to verse 41. Read that with me. It says, "And they, the disciples, were filled with great fear and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the seas obey him?'" So after the disciples, while they're in the storm, in the boat, they witnessed Jesus rebuke the wind and the sea and cause the storm to be able to stop. They were fearful. But now, they're fearful not because they were afraid of the storm and afraid of dying. Now they were afraid because they had realized that now they were in the presence of God. Think about it. They had spent, as the disciples, many times with Jesus. They left their jobs and they went where Jesus went. They listened to him teach. They saw him perform so many miracles, like healing and casting out demons from people. And yet, they didn't realize that Jesus was God until probably at this moment, in this storm, as Jesus led them into the storm, and this storm brought them to him. So let's answer our main question that we're going to go through. So how can we trust Jesus in our storms? Here is the first point, the first way. Trust Jesus as he leads us into our storms. Trust Jesus as he leads us into our storms. So many of us know we go through many spiritual storms in our lives. Jesus is the one who leads us through these times of trials, suffering, and hardships. And whenever we are in these situations, I want us to stop. I want us to think about how can this hardship lead us to know and grow in Jesus. Focus on this rather than the situation itself. Know that if Jesus really led you in this situation, into this storm, that he would also be the one to lead you out of it and lead you towards him as well. Many of us know that recently in the news, about a week and a half ago, that Russia had invaded Ukraine. This is something that's been on the news, and it's something that has been on everyone's minds, and it really bothers us because we see the effects of war, especially on innocent families. I know of a pastor in Virginia. He was born in Ukraine, but now he's in the U.S. He still has family over there, and he had shared with me that there are many of his own family members who were displaced. So in the midst of this war, many of these families, they had to try to seek shelter and go into other different countries. And they didn't have any food, they didn't have any clothing or money with them. They just had what they had to be able to carry them. And for those families that weren't able to really safely travel and try to get away, they hid in bomb shelters underground. These bomb shelters, they were just like a few feet in width. So imagine like a lot of people in these like small bomb shelters. But what he said is that the Christians that in Ukraine that are hiding in these bomb shelters, and I saw a video, they were singing praises to God. They were praying to one another, and they were encouraging one another too. So like one thing that I guess this pastor had shared with me is that in the midst of the storm, this trial that the Ukrainian Christians are going through, in the midst of this war, they were still able to trust in Jesus and encourage one another. So in the midst of the storm, this storm actually gave them an opportunity to test their faith and bring them closer to Jesus. Let me share another example. In the 1700s, there was a young woman named Anne Steele. She's from the UK, and she had encountered a lot of trials and disappointments, one after another in her life. You see, like her mother had died when she was just 3 years old. And then when she was 19, she had suffered from a severe hip injury that had left her to be invalid. And also later on in life, she had fell in love with a man and was engaged to be married. But then the day before her wedding, her fiancé unfortunately had drowned. So Anne Steele, like in 1700, she had gone through a lot of hardships and trials in her lives. But later on in life, she had written a song. She wrote a hymn, and these were the following words of this hymn. Father, whatever of earthly bliss, thy sovereign will denies. Accept at thy throne of grace, let this petition rise. Give a calm, a thankful heart, for every murmur free. The blessings of thy grace impart, and make me live to thee. So think about it. How can someone write a song like this to God, describing about his grace, describing of his blessings and being thankful to God after experiencing so many troubles and trials in the storms of her life? See, only someone who has trusted Jesus in the storms and was brought closer to him can be able to write a song like this. So again, our question, how can we trust Jesus during our storms? Again, we said the first point, trust Jesus as he leads us into our storms. Now, I acknowledge that even if it's true that Jesus is the one who leads us in our storms, and he is using them to bring us closer to him, but I know this doesn't make it a lot easier. I know that it doesn't mean that our storms aren't hard and they aren't easy. And I know that a lot of times, many times the situation can be very great and can be very, very painful. So let us see how hard this situation was with the 12 disciples as Jesus led them into this storm. Read again with me, starting from verse 37 of Mark chapter 4. It says, "And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling." So again, as Jesus got into the boat with his disciples, this great windstorm came. And I want you to picture yourself in this situation, in this boat. Imagine icy cold winds pushing against your face. Imagine as like people around you are shouting to one another about what we should be able to do to try to keep the boat from capsizing. We have to make sure that we man the sails, and imagine like there are big waves that are crashing up against the boat. It's hard for everyone to keep their balance while they're on this boat too. Water was already piling into the boat, and some people, you can imagine, trying to grab buckets to scoop up water to to bring to the other side to try to lighten the weight of the boat. Maybe some people had to throw away some of the cargo on board so that we won't be too heavy and be able to sink. In this situation, in this storm, it was very scary for these disciples. It was a life-threatening situation. But in the midst of this situation, what was Jesus doing? Let's read with me from verse 38. But he, Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" So in the midst of this life-threatening situation, Jesus was sleeping. And he was on his own cushion too. So not only was Jesus sleeping, but he was comfortable with where he was. And imagine all the 12 disciples scrambling around trying to keep the boats from trying to be capsized. And Jesus was just sleeping and not doing anything to help. The disciples woke Jesus up. And what did they say? "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" See, sometimes I believe as we are going through the storms and trials in our lives, these spiritual storms, we can often feel as if Jesus doesn't care about us. We can often feel that Jesus is just sleeping and he doesn't seem to answer when we call out for him to help us. You see, a few years ago when I was in seminary, another student and I, we had to go through a preaching class. And in this class, we were given one assignment where we were actually studying this exact passage. We had to take a truth from Scripture and be able to develop it. So as a joke, as we got to this particular verse in verse 38, we came up with a joke sermon points that basically went, Jesus doesn't care if you die. Now, I guess if you heard this in a sermon, you'd be very shocked about it because it's not true. But even though the sermon point is not true, that Jesus doesn't care about us, but it does reflect how, in the midst of our storms, how we can actually feel in our hearts as we are going through something like this. Because oftentimes when we go through our storms, in our hardships and trials, we can often feel that Jesus doesn't care about us. When my daughter Olive was a baby, just born not too long ago, in the middle of the night, she would wake up a lot of times and she wouldn't be held, she wanted to be fed. And my wife, Joyce, would be right next to me and she would be hitting me because I am a very heavy sleeper. So I was just sleeping the whole time, even when my daughter was crying. And my wife could wonder, do you even care about our daughter? Do you even wake up to be able to go take care of her? So again, she has to turn to me and hit me just to wake me up, just so I can go take care of my daughter and go feed her. You see, it's very easy for us to interpret that when someone is sleeping and very oblivious to what's happening around them, that they don't care about you. They don't care about what is happening. And it's possible that all these disciples had thought this way as they were trying to keep the boat afloat and they see Jesus sleeping on the cushion. But I want us to see that, what if Jesus' act of sleeping actually shows that he really cares for us? I know, it seems like a paradox. What if Jesus sleeping actually does show that he cared for us? So let's answer our question again. How can we trust Jesus during our storms? So here is the second point, the second way. Trust Jesus in his understanding and compassion for us. So again, trust Jesus in his understanding and compassion for us. You see, when Jesus was sleeping during this storm on the boat, it really reflects Jesus' humanity. Yes, Jesus is 100% God, and he's also 100% human. And we focus a lot on Jesus in his being as a God and as deity, but I think a lot of times we don't emphasize too much on Jesus' humanity as well. Because Jesus is a human being. When he came to this world, he had a human body. He had a physical human body. This means that he can get tired. This means that as he was sleeping through the storm, it shows that he had physical exhaustion. One of the reasons why he wanted to go to the other side of the sea in the first place, because he had spent a whole day teaching people in the crowds. And because of this, it's been the end of the day and he is tired. So he knows what it's like to experience exhaustion after a long day. But the thing is that Jesus would understand this about us is because he had experienced this himself too. So Jesus understands our storms, our trials, our hardships, anything that we can go through in this life, because he knows the human experience. He knows what it's like to be hungry. He knows what it's like to be tired. He knows what it's like to be betrayed. He knows what it's like to be tempted with sin, even though he himself never gave in to sin, and he never sinned at all. Jesus can be able to identify with us in our storms and anything that we may experience in this life, because he had experienced similar things with a physical human body. Consider Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 to 15. It says this: "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." So this is Hebrews 4, 14 to 15. So in this verse, it shows how Jesus sympathizes with us. He identifies with us. He understands us. He cares for us, especially during our storms. So again, how can we trust Jesus during our storms? The second point, trust Jesus in his understanding and compassion for us. Now, during our storms, when it seems as if Jesus is just sleeping, when it seems as if Jesus doesn't care at all, remind yourself that he does understand, that he does care, because of his humanity, because he had experienced what we have experienced. And as we think about the Ukrainian Christians who are now in the midst of a spiritual war, in the midst of a spiritual storm, they also are going through this. This applies to them. We should also pray for our brothers and sisters in Ukraine, because they may doubt and wonder whether Jesus does care for them during this war. So again, remember that Jesus leads us into our storms, but our storms should lead us to Jesus. And Jesus sleeping during the storm, again, emphasizes that he has humanity. That it doesn't just show that his understanding and his care for us, but it also shows that he knows what we are going through and what is going to happen. Why? Because he is actually in control of the situation. Yeah, think about it this way. Jesus is able to sleep in the middle of this storm, in the midst of his disciples, because he knows what's going to happen. He knows that he is in control. So this brings us to our third and final point for today. So how can we trust Jesus in the midst of our storms? Here is the third point, the third way. Trust Jesus in his control over all things. Trust Jesus in his control over all things. Let's return back to our passage, again, Mark chapter 4, and let's read from verse 38. It says this: "But he was in the storm, asleep on a cushion, and they woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm." So after the disciples woke Jesus up, Jesus got up, he rebuked the wind, he rebuked the sea, he commanded them to be still and to stop and be peaceful, and immediately all the winds just suddenly stopped. Immediately the waves just calmed down, and basically nothing was happening anymore. So I want to imagine how this happened. Everything was very dark. There was a wind blowing. There was thunder in the background. You can't even hear anything. And winds were hitting against the boats, going back and forth. But as soon as Jesus stood up, woke up, and he rebuked the winds and the sea, everything just immediately stopped. And all of a sudden you hear birds chirping. It was bright and sunny again, and it was just sudden quietness. It was awkward silence, and it's almost as if when someone were to do a giant cannonball into a swimming pool, you see that there are giant waves that are moving in because of this cannonball. But imagine all the waves, it should eventually slow down into nothing. But what if when Jesus was commanding the sea and the winds to stop and be peaceful, big waves all of a sudden just boom, very silent. And it just stops just like that. Imagine how unusual that would be. There was this sense of power and awe that was there as Jesus calmed the storm. It's all of a sudden like this storm just like became calm. Again, this act shows that Jesus has authority over all creation. Jesus is in control of everything. So again, how can we trust Jesus during our storms? The third way, the third point, trust in Jesus in his control over all things. Jesus is in control over the spiritual storms that you are going through right now. He's in control of your hardships. He's in control of your trials. Yes, he's the one who may have led you into this storm, but he also has control to be able to get you out of that storm. He has the power and control to save you and to protect you from that storm too. And he has control to be able to use the storm to lead you back to him too. There once was a young baby bear cub, and let's say that he was playing in the jungle, and there was a lion that had all of a sudden spotted this young bear cub. And this bear cub, he froze in fear as he saw the lion slowly approaching him. And just as the lion was about 15 feet away from the baby cub, it suddenly froze and then got afraid, and the lion just ran away. So this baby bear became very proud and thought, even though I'm small, I can be able to scare away this big and giant lion who can be able to kill me. I am very powerful. But then, as he turned around, who did he see? This baby cub actually saw his mom, so Mama Bear, right behind him. So really, the lion was not afraid of this baby bear cub, but rather he was afraid of who was backing him up. You see, likewise, I believe that in the midst of our trials and storms, anything that we go through, Jesus is also there, right behind us to back us up. He's in control of the situation. He's in control of our storms. And it is not us who is in control. You see, in this situation, for a second, this baby bear cub had thought that he was in control of the situation. He thought he was the one who was able to scare away this lion. But I think likewise, even though Jesus is in control of everything, sometimes we may feel that we can take care of ourselves. Sometimes we can think, I can be able to get myself out of this situation. I can be able to do something to be able to save myself. So even in the midst of the storm that the disciples were in, imagine that these disciples, many of them, they used to be fishermen in their past life. They know how to control the sail of the boats. They know how to be able to do in these stormy situations, to be able to control the sails and to be able to control the boats from being capsized. It would have been impossible for them to be able to escape alive in the storm by their own means. It would have been impossible. But see, it's only what Jesus can be able to do. As he was in control of everything, he rebuked the winds and the storms, and he calmed everything to be able to save them. It is not us who is in control, not what we can be able to do, but it is what Jesus can be able to do. So again, how can we trust Jesus during our storms? The third point, the third way, trust Jesus in his control over all things. So as you are in the midst of your own storms, do you try to be in control? Do you think that you can find your own way out and that you can be able to do something to save yourself? I think a lot of times, again, we may think that we are in this situation. And if we find ourselves in this situation, we need to stop. We need to humble ourselves and surrender our will to God and trust that Jesus is in control of everything. Yes, we need to do our parts. Yes, we need to trust in Jesus, but we need to acknowledge that he is in control of everything. Again, our reminder, Jesus leads us into our storms, but our storms should lead us to Jesus. So let's review everything that we've learned from this passage here in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. Again, we've answered the main question of how can we trust Jesus during our storms? And we said that there are three ways. So to review the first way, trust Jesus as he leads us into the storms. Second way, trust Jesus in his understanding and his compassion for us. And finally, as we just said, the third way, trust Jesus in his control over all things. So again, no matter what trials, what storms, what sufferings that you may be going through, I know that during this pandemic, throughout the past almost 2 years or so, it has been very hard for many of us, especially as students. We've experienced loss of relationships. We've experienced a distrust in God. We have experienced we sometimes feel like we've been robbed of our school experience too. But as we go through these things, and whatever we may go through in the future, can we be able to trust in Jesus and remember these truths that we've learned from this passage? Notice that all these main points that I have just read out and pulled out from this passage, they all are supposed to point us back to Jesus. Again, Jesus is the one who leads us into our storms, but our storms should lead us back to Jesus. If we keep this in our mind, then Satan cannot use the storms that we go through, these trials, to draw us away from Jesus. With this perspective that we have as Christians, we can be able to see how the storms that we go through can actually bring us closer to Jesus. And see, this is the exact results that had happened as Jesus brought the disciples through the storm. Let's jump back to our passage and read from verse 40 again. Mark chapter 4, verse 40. He, Jesus, said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So in our storms, will we hear Jesus asking us why we are afraid and whether we have faith? Or will we be like the disciples who ended up in a position where they can recognize more of who Jesus is, in particular, that Jesus is truly God, that Jesus is their Messiah? And it's my hope and prayer that we can come to this same position that the disciples had as we go through the storm in our lives. Let's also pray again for our Ukrainian brothers and sisters who are in the midst of a spiritual storm right now in this war in their own country. These truths that we learn from this passage also applies to them as well. Pray and consider maybe we can be able to support them as a church. My church today, we just announced that we are going to start to collect a donation to financially support those Ukrainian families who have been displaced in this war. So there's some trusted organizations that can be able to use these funds that are raised to be able to buy medical supplies, to buy food and clothing and other needs to help these families, whether they are traveling to another country or whether they are staying in a shelter. No, God can be able to use us as their brothers and sisters to encourage them and to point to them that they can still trust in Jesus. God can use us to show that Jesus does still love and care for them in the midst of these storms. This is what we should be doing as a church. If you were going through a hard time in your life, wouldn't you want someone in the church, someone who you trust, someone who you love and care for you, to be able to remind you that Jesus is in control, that you can be able to trust in him? We can do the same for our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. So let us trust Jesus during our storms. And with that, I encourage you all to bow your heads with me. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you. Again, we're so grateful that we had this chance to be able to read from your word and be able to see the wonderful things that are in it. Thank you that you have taught us how we can be able to trust you and how we can have this perspective of these spiritual storms that we may go through in our lives. Father, maybe some of us right here are going through a storm right now. We feel very painful. We feel that no one can be able to understand. Maybe we experience the loss of a loved one. Maybe we have a lot of trouble that is inside us. Maybe we're being bullied. Maybe we're in financial trouble. Lord, no matter what it may be, you know what is going on. You may lead us into these storms, but Lord, these storms should point us back to you. I pray that you would be able to protect us. I pray that you would be able to open our eyes so that we can be able to see how there are other people who can be able to help us too, and be able to see how you are a God who loves and cares for us. Father, we are so thankful for this time that we have together. We're going to lift up all these things in Jesus Christ's precious and holy name. Amen.